Hello and welcome to Murder in the UK. Today we're looking at the case of Daniel Bartlam. Daniel Bartlam was a 14-year-old lad who had an argument with his mother. He beat her with a hammer while she was asleep, padded her and the bedclothes with paper and then set the lot on fire. He was sentenced to prison for at least 16 years. What's your thought on this case? Make a comment below. To find out more, visit www.murderuk.com or stay tuned for a video documentary about this case. Thank you.
In this programme, Daniel Bartlam, the Coronation Street killer. At just 14, he took a hammer to his mother's skull and set her body ablaze in an attempt to commit the perfect murder.
He believes he can pull off the great crime, he can pull off murder and get away with it.
Did this relationship between a mother and her son have any impact on this descent into terrifying and gruesome? How does the criminal mind mature? Well, like the rest of us, serial killers and murderers learn by experience, adapting their behaviour to suit their needs. But what happens when the mind isn't mature, when it's still in early adolescence? Kids who kill are one of our worst nightmares, perverting our long-held belief in the innocence of childhood.
We now know that Daniel Bartlam planned to kill his mum. He then executed the killing in a violent attack on her.
Daniel Bartlam was just 14 years old when he savagely beat his own mother to death with a claw hammer and then set fire to their family home in a desperate attempt to conceal the crime.
Meeting him at 11 years old, I never thought he'd be capable of that sort of violence.
Bartlam's story was short and simple. An interrupted burglar had attacked and then killed his mother before setting fire to the body. The story was a transparent one, though, and the police very quickly found clear evidence of how he had planned the killing. His family, friends, and even the police themselves were shocked at the discovery.
There are very few cases I've covered as a reporter involving young people as young as Daniel. It's surprising that compared to some notoriously dangerous criminals, Daniel Bartlam was scary in another way.
In the very house behind me, in his first floor bedroom, Daniel Bartlam wrote a soap script on his laptop.
It was awful to hear in court how a 14-year-old boy had been Googling how to get away with murder, and then he'd written his own play on his iMac computer.
In this story, Daniel casts himself as a murderer, a master criminal, and a serial rapist. It's a horrific portrait of a psychopath that no one could have imagined would become reality.
Most boys of his age were thinking about football and computer games. He was thinking about killing his own mum.
But how did a 14-year-old turn into a murderer? Why did Daniel take a claw hammer to his own mother? Daniel was born on the 11th of November 1996 to Jacqueline Bryant and Adrian Bartlam here in Nottinghamshire. He was the couple's firstborn and Jackie adored him. The couple were married 3 years later and Daniel, suited and booted, was the picture of innocence. However, the marriage began to fall apart, and in 2005, shortly after his younger brother Dominic was born, the couple divorced. To begin with, Daniel seemed to take the split in his stride, living with his mom, Jackie, and spending his weekends with his dad. A few years after the marriage breakup, Jackie met a new partner, Simon Matters.
Well, initially when I met him, he was quite engaging. He talked to you about anything really, and he was only about 11 at the time. A lot of the time he would try and talk to you about things that he knew nothing of, but he was just sort of trying to impress you. But quite a pleasant chap.
Is that a good camera angle?
Yay!
When Simon met Jackie, she was starting a new life for herself and her sons. At first, Daniel seemed like a normal 11-year-old, but soon Simon noticed that his behaviour was deteriorating.
I think the main problem with Daniel was the divorce going back, even though that had been a few years before. Daniel started pinching his little brother and sort of hitting him when his mum wasn't looking. But his brother was much younger than him, And there were incidences where I saw Daniel give him a dig in the ribs, for example, when they were passing each other. And his little brother being 3 or 4, he'd sort of, scream. But on the other hand, they'd be sat on the settee watching TV together, and Daniel would be showing his brother loads of love. So it was sort of, is that normal or is it just kids playing,
Following the divorce, his mother's attentions would have been on the small child, on his baby brother. And as usually you get in that situation, a new person in the family, there would be tensions between Daniel and the small child, and there would be some sibling rivalry. Perhaps that was something that was a growing problem for Daniel to deal with.
And this wasn't Daniel's only issue.
His mother may have been preoccupied with her new partner, and that Daniel felt emotionally neglected and he'd lost the relationship with his mother.
All his family doted on him. There's no one who would, they all looked after him, they all cared about him. They all doted on him, had a lot of love around him, yeah.
Despite the loving environment, Daniel's behaviour was about to get worse. Eventually, he withdrew into his room and became more and more aggressive towards his mother. Jackie did her best to stay cool, hoping it was just a phase and that the worst of it would pass.
Jackie would keep it all in, and you could see the stress levels building with her.
The divorce of Bartlem's parents would have been a traumatic event for him, but can we attribute any of his crime to this shattering emotional moment? It's undeniable that obviously divorce is always a traumatic event for any child, but what impact did this have on the crime?
I think when you look at the experience of many children in society, lots of them go through the separation and the divorce of a parent. So it's very difficult to be able to make that causal link between this and what later happened. But I think for Daniel Bartlam, what we've got here is it's about control for him. When his parents separate, when his world is disrupted, he loses control over his personal situation. And I think that's the seed from which the later events grow.
And did he lose his place, his status within that family?
I think that's right. There would have been a particular dynamic in that family. He would have known his position within that family and the amount of power and control he had through where he was. And then to have that disrupted, he's got to find his feet again. He's got to find himself in a position to be able to control the others around him again. And that's something that he would have been quite frustrated by.
So in terms of this divorce, one can say is actually it was a life event. If it wasn't this divorce, it would have been another trigger that would have sent him down this path.
Yeah, I think that's right. It would have been something that made him feel he was losing control of his personal situation.
So even for a child like that, it is like a lot of other perpetrators, it's still about control and power.
It's very much about control and power, absolutely.
I've seen it a lot with young girls around that age, where in order to re-exert power on their environment, they self-harm. But there's no sign of that here.
No, and when you look at how individuals react to this type of thing, they'll often do one of two things. They'll either internalise it, so they will self-harm, they'll take it out on themselves, they'll lose themselves in a fantasy world, or they'll externalise it. So they'll begin to display violent behaviour, they might harm others. And I think what's going on at this point in time is that Daniel's internalising these things that are happening to him.
Coming up, the flashpoint that led to murder.
His fists were clenched and he was shouting, sort of right in the face, sort of nose to nose.
6 years after his parents' traumatic divorce, Daniel Bartlam savagely beat his mother to death with a claw hammer before burning her body and setting fire to the crime scene. He'd had a radical change in his home life, but what provoked him towards psychosis, into becoming a cold-blooded killer? At 13, the effect of the divorce on Daniel was already showing, but there was another dramatic change in the family's circumstances. To make ends meet, Jackie had to sell the family home, which meant asking Daniel to make a sacrifice of his own.
It did emerge that the background of Daniel and how he'd been to a private school, and then when his parents divorced, it meant that he had to go to a mainstream school. And I think it seemed like a lot of the problems began to happen after then.
What had happened was that Daniel's father had used to pay for him to go to a private school. Jackie decided that she needed to downsize the house. So she bought another nice house, which is a lovely house, in another part of Nottingham in Arnold, and told Daniel that he would be going to a sort of a normal school.
The disruption of divorce, moving home and school was to prove extremely unsettling for the young boy.
He liked the large house and he liked to be at a private school. I think that was a sort of status symbol for him. So when that was going to change, he didn't want that change. So the arguments were then, it's all your fault we got divorced. My dad didn't want to get divorced, etc., etc., and it was all Jackie's fault, even though he didn't know the facts. But all you would hear was Daniel shouting and swearing regarding the fact that he was having this sort of quite a big change in his life.
I think probably Daniel had some fairly obsessive traits of trying to keep things the same, and this was a massive disruption to the fabric of his life. He blamed it on the mother, and the father would probably be the more innocent role, the person that he had more of a kind of relationship with, and the person who he saw less of, and therefore someone who could be fictionalised more into being the good guy.
He'd start swearing at his mum, saying, I'm not leaving school, you know, I can still go to this school. And in actual fact, his mum did pay for him to continue at the private school off her own back for probably about 6 months. She went totally out of her way to sort of appease him.
From what I heard in court, Jacqueline Bartlam was a lovely, caring, supported mother. She had arguments with Daniel Bartlam like any mother would have. He lived in a nice house. Everything that he wanted, he had.
As Jackie was settling everyone into the new home in Arnold, Daniel began to isolate himself and chose to lock himself away in his room.
You know, he would never, for example, go out and play football, just a normal thing that kids would do. He'd never do anything like that. It would always be something that I wouldn't expect 11, 12-year-olds to do, playing 18-rated games or watching Coronation Street, for example, which he loved. But I wouldn't expect an 11, 12-year-old to be doing that.
Whilst alone in his room and away from the prying eyes of his mother, he began to develop a disturbing pastime. There he would watch graphically violent DVDs and TV shows, most of which were 18-rated. Then he would post his favourite clips, those dealing in death and murder, online on YouTube.
He was watching some quite horrific horror movies, violent horror movies and gory horror movies at around age 8 and 9, which was completely inappropriate imagery for a child of that age.
Clearly his mum was being liberal or letting him have access to materials that he probably shouldn't have seen at his age. And indeed, his own stepfather had been concerned about him having access to such inappropriate material.
The effects that would have had is that he will look for violence in anything that he's watching from that point on, because what has happened is his body's become excited and aroused through the flight-fear response of being scared to violent imagery.
Left alone with the videos, Daniel found a worrying form of self-expression.
Daniel just took in these images and let them foster and fester in his mind to become something that was almost bubbling out. He almost felt probably a frustration that he wasn't able to enact what was going on in his head, so he would produce stories.
I was downstairs one day. Daniel just came down into the kitchen and showed me this story that he'd written. It's a handwritten story, and it was about two lads who were walking to school. One had started picking on the other had fought back, and there was some sort of running battle towards school. And then the lad who'd been picked on in the first place ended up stabbing the lad who was picking on him. So I read it, gave it him back, and I was just like, well, why have you written that? And then he showed his mum quite proudly, and she was the same as me. Well, what have you written that for, Daniel?
He would write out violent episodes. He would produce perhaps drawings or whatever kind of output, but this wasn't actually fulfilling what he needed, which was actual enactment.
Back in his room, Daniel made use of a new computer, a gift from his dad, experimenting with it like any teenager would.
Hello YouTube, this is Daniel AB1702 here. And it's finally happened. I now have an iMac and I can now make bigger and better videos.
He became fascinated with Coronation Street, and in particular one episode featuring a character called John Stake, who kills a woman with a hammer and conceals her body in a fire. He would eventually write a script featuring himself getting away with the exact same crime, but with his mother as the tragic victim.
The violence in horror movies would have shocked him, excited him, aroused him, but he wouldn't necessarily copy those because they were outside his reality. However, when he then concentrated on the violence in soaps that are like his reality, family arguments, family breakdown, all the things that he experienced, what he locked into in that soap was the excitement of the violence, the murder.
Bartlam became obsessed not just with the violence, but with getting away with it. So he became very interested in the state storyline in Coronation Street, because not only does the killer engage in a bloodthirsty, vicious murder, but he gets away with fooling everybody by disguising the death.
Coronation Street was probably some kind of instrumental thing in giving him a plan, or the basis of a plan, of something that he could enact himself. His mother was readily accessible, she was hated, the wherewithal was there.
Was Daniel just an emotionally confused and lost boy looking for answers and an outlet for his anger? And should his mother have been much more concerned about his escalating fascination with violent videos? And if she had intervened, would it have made any difference?
He's creating these stories which feature real people. So that, for me, I think is the point at which, you know, fantasy goes into reality and internalising becomes externalising.
In other cases, there'd be some degree of transference, a different name. It would obviously be Daniel's character. That's a real signpost.
Yes, it is. There isn't any kind of attempt to cover this up.
No camouflage, no disguise.
No, it's very much, this is all about me.
You know, I'm not convinced that the videos play a significant part. It's part of a journey, but to my mind, it's kind of nearly a rite of passage for teenagers. So in one sense, this is kind of normal behaviour for him. Lots of his other stuff was not, but this not hugely significant for me.
No, not for me either. I think there's been a debate raging for many years about the impact of violent media. Does it make people go out and commit violent acts? What effect does it have? And actually, there's not very much evidence to say that there's a direct causal link between viewing this type of thing and then going out and harming somebody. They're just one of the many things that were in the background for Daniel Bartlam.
Much more important is that the increasing isolation within his little bedroom, his world was getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and this kind of desensitization from reality. He's actually losing a huge amount of motherly time.
His position in the family is very kind of uncertain at this point in time. So very kind of chaotic, a very difficult situation to control for anybody, but particularly for somebody like Daniel, for whom control is a really, really important thing.
When Daniel did emerge from his room, he would find new ways to get his family's attention, ones that Jackie would struggle to ignore.
His favourite trick was to push it to the limit, to see how far they could push them before they actually snapped. I always said Jackie's favourite word was Daniel. She'd shout Daniel with a big exclamation mark, as if to say, what's going on?
As Simon spent more time with the family, he noticed their problems grow. He was particularly surprised one morning as he and Daniel worked together to help clear Jackie's new garden pond.
Jackie was at work, I went round to help. She had a garden pond, started clearing the pond, chopping bits back and taking out the dead bits. Daniel's off school that day. It was about dinner time. I said, look, I'm going to go and get a sandwich. Came back and the pond, every single plant in it had been totally chopped back, destroyed. A right mess. And I was just flabbergasted. I'm like, well, you know, we'd cut it back and generally just finished it, so it would look nice and neat, but he'd literally destroyed the whole pond. So I questioned him about it, and he said I was just trying to help. And at that point, I can remember, you know, like it was yesterday, he literally just lost his temper, started crying.
When it came to his mother, the confrontations were worse, and Daniel's aggression became much harder to manage.
Daniel had wanted a pizza and his mum wouldn't order him one because they'd already had some food. He then proceeded to order it himself, and when it came he paid for it out of his own money. He'd got more and more annoyed with the fact that his mum had questioned why he'd ordered a pizza after he'd already had his tea. This is the first time I'd actually seen them stand toe-to-toe. Jackie was sat down on the settee. He sort of stood over her. His fists were clenched and he was shouting right in her face, swearing and sort of shouting, "I hate you." Daniel then ran upstairs and he was stood at the top of the landing for probably a good, what seemed like about 2-3 minutes. And he started hitting himself and hitting the walls, screaming. I'd heard arguments and shouting between the two, but nothing like that. That was the first time I'd ever seen, him get that close to her.
If Jackie couldn't ignore his aggressive teen tantrums, then confrontation was proving equally hard. Was there anything she could have done to correct his alarming behaviour? But the role of Simon in this is quite interesting because I get the sense that Jackie wanted him around more and more. And not only just to be a kind of bit of a referee, a bit of a policeman, a bit of a manager of this kind of strange environment, but also to be a kind of male role model.
Maybe she thinks that at this point in time, this might be, the magic thing that is gonna make this behaviour, make him rein it in a little bit.
I just wonder if she pulled the rein a little tighter, and he referenced that tight rein, but clearly wasn't tight enough.
When parents do try and discipline children who are behaving in this way and being very kind of narcissistic and very self-centered, often that kind of tough love doesn't work. If anything, sometimes it escalates the behaviour further. So it could be that his mother had tried to discipline him and it just hadn't worked. So she'd given up trying that particular path.
So in this kind of state of denial, you look at a parent's guilt, the parent's divorce, kids a bit dislocated, they come across strange writings. A mother's unlikely to kind of start to label, because to do that is to kind of elevate the guilt she feels. It's best perhaps to be in a state of denial, to ignore these writings and move on.
There's been a turbulent period, maybe he's coping with it in his own way by doing these things, and he'll move on from it, he'll get over it, it will be okay. And you can understand how somebody would rationalise it in that way and choose not to further spark the fire. So you can understand his mum didn't do anything at this point.
And one thing stands out for me. So he goes and he creates and works with Simon, Jackie's partner, and builds this wonderful fish pond, and it's a wonderful kind of bonding experience, and Simon undoubtedly would have been enjoying that. And then all of a sudden, the minute Simon leaves and when it's all completed, he destroys it. So to my mind, he planned to create just for the purpose of destroying.
Exactly. And this isn't behind a screen or behind his bedroom door anymore. This is now becoming much more visible. Daniel knows that Simon is going to feel devastated by him doing that, and that's why he does that, because people like Daniel enjoy playing with the emotions of others.
One really strange event, they have a lovely family dinner, and then he decides, which is a direct insult to Mama, he decides he's going to order a pizza. And then the pizza arrives, and this provokes an extraordinary row. I think part of the reason why she'll let him get away with some of this really, egregious behaviour is because she was scared.
She's adopting, I think, this trial and error approach because she simply does not know what to do with this young lad who is, increasingly spiralling out of control. He's reading other people's behaviour and how they're reacting to him. And by going upstairs and appearing to self-harm, he's kind of, flipping the situation around and changing it, and I'm the victim now. So this is a young lad who's really acutely aware of other people's emotions and exactly what he needs to do to manipulate them.
Well, coming up, Daniel goes walkabout and begins to exhibit even more worrying behaviour.
If I was, dealing with somebody that was hearing voices, defecating around a room and having massive fantasies, I'd be seriously concerned that they were on the limits of personality disorder.
At just 12 years of age, Daniel was writing graphic scripts detailing gruesome and violent murders. Just 2 years later, he acted upon them, savagely killing his own mother. There were warning signs. How come his mother never noticed? Jackie attempted to look past his challenging behaviour, but it was about to become even more extreme and obscene.
About 2009, a lot of things started worrying me about what we found in his bedroom, but then when we actually started clearing out his room, I found a collection of Jackie's underwear in a briefcase.
Some people may interpret the fact that he stole his mother's underwear as there was some psychosexual aspect to that, which, given that he's a growing young man, there might have been. But I think it was just a cry for attention.
Perhaps in some way, Daniel was actually kind of grasping back a certain amount of power from his mother. He'd lost when it came to the divorce.
His mother, Jackie, chose to play down the hidden lingerie incident as best she could.
On that particular occasion, she did laugh it off. She said, well, I wondered where all that had gone. But there was no explanation or there was no inkling that she was going to say anything to Daniel about it. He just laughed off and that was it.
Jackie's lack of reaction may have backfired. Did it appear as though she didn't care?
He was deliberately being naughty and he wanted his mother's attention and his mother to come and tell him off and find her underwear. He just wanted any form of interaction, and his behaviour got worse and worse and worse to get that interaction, because interacting with your mum by being naughty and getting her attention by telling you off is better than getting no attention at all.
Daniel certainly got their attention when Simon and Jackie uncovered a disgusting surprise as they cleaned out his room.
I then started finding he'd urinated in plastic tubs of toys. He liked his sci-fi stuff, Star Wars and that sort of thing. If you looked at the tub you wouldn't know, but when you started moving stuff out, it had been ruined, and he'd also defecated in these tubs as well and left sort of dirty towels around the place, under the bed, in the boxes. So all that sort of stuff was adding up, and it was sort of, it's not really quite right, this.
When individuals are going through psychiatric distress and their reactions or responses can be unpredictable, it's very hard for parents or loved ones to actually challenge them.
I think that he did suffer emotional neglect, and that when he started to toilet in his own room, this was a cry for attention.
The fact that Daniel actually urinated on his Star Wars figures and defecated not only there but also all around his room is the kind of bizarre, fragmented behaviour we get when someone is slightly schizotypal, which is kind of muted form of schizophrenia. It's where his idea of fantasy and reality is completely disturbed, and he starts to give things more significance and meaning.
But it also might be, I hate you, you bought me these toys, and this is what I'm going to do to them. So it is an indication that he began to hate his mother and feel aggressive towards her, and his aggression was being, at that time, redirected to the toys that she had bought him.
Finally, would this provoke Jackie to take notice and question his behaviour?
Jackie's reaction with the tub thing was one of, pretty horrific. She just said that's what kids do. Daniel just didn't give a damn about anything. He just sort of didn't realise the value of money, didn't realise the value of the toys he'd got, didn't respect them. Even though he had an ensuite in that particular room, he couldn't be bothered to get up and go to the toilet. He would do it in the tubs. Had it been me, I would have took him to task, but obviously I wasn't going to because he wasn't my son. But I was pretty horrified what I saw, because obviously I was the one that's cleaning it up.
Daniel didn't seem to be getting the response he desired from his mother, so he took matters even further. Looking for attention or acting out another fantasy, he ran away from home.
Jackie rang to say that Daniel had run away. She was frantic with worry because obviously she didn't know where he'd gone. But he'd sort of done it for attention before.
His disappearance sparks a police search and leads to Daniel's first encounter with the law.
He'd run from the new house. He's trying to make his way to the old house.
Police found him at 1 a.m. walking towards where he'd lived with his parents before they divorced. While it was clear there'd been a serious disagreement, it was never really revealed why he'd run away. When the police dropped him home, Jackie didn't flag up her concerns, so they simply left her to deal with the matter. Was Jackie hoping that Daniel's behaviour was nothing serious, or could she have intervened to prevent him drifting further from her reach? My first initial reaction is this is like a cry for help.
On the surface, if you look at this behaviour, running away from home, running back to a place where, you know, his family was kind of secure, and you might interpret that as, you know, a cry for help, as somebody wanting to return to a situation which was comfortable for them. And I think Daniel was well aware of the impact that behaviour would have on his mother, and feel guilty about that. And I think that's exactly what he was doing. That's exactly the kind of feeling he was trying to generate. So I think it was very carefully orchestrated.
He did his own form of the kind of paramilitary dirty protest. What he did, he defecated on his precious toys, expensive toys, and urinated on them. And, you know, you get it as a form of protest, but he's seeking and provoking a reaction.
My reaction to this is perhaps what Daniel was trying to engender in his mum, you know, a state of confusion. Why is he doing this? A real state of anxiety and concern for his son.
In military terms, I talk about a choke point, certain crossroads which are really significant. And for him, moving out of his old childhood home into a new home, into a destabilising, unusual, fresh environment, it's a difficult time. And he was keen to let everyone know this was a difficult time.
Yeah, he was, absolutely. And that manifested itself in him, you know, running away and going back to the house in which he used to live to basically say, you know, oh, look at the terrible impact that the breakup of this family has had on this young lad. So he's being incredibly cunning, very manipulative there.
Back home and safe, I'm sure Jackie had hoped that things might soon return to normal. However, just a few months later, Daniel was referred to the on-site counsellor here at his school after telling his fellow pupils that his tie, which he named Fred, was trying to strangle him. He told the counsellor he was hearing voices. These voices told him to hurt people who'd upset him, to stab them with a knife and to kill them.
He was in class, but he'd started pulling at his tie and shouting that his tie was talking to him, and hearing voices in his head as well. But 12, 13-year-old kids, little lads in the class, they're probably going to laugh at it. They're not going to know the significance of that.
It may be that Daniel was actually reporting hearing voices, and this could be aligned with schizophrenia-like symptoms. And perhaps the defecation around the room and urinating inappropriately. These are characteristics that you would see in schizophrenia, you know, when it's completely unmedicated, etc. But it clearly was not picked up psychiatrically.
I think it's unusual at that age to be hearing that your own son or daughter is going through mental health issues at 12 years old and hearing voices. Quite worrying, really, isn't it?
If I was, you know, dealing with somebody that was hearing voices, defecating around a room and having massive fantasies and relaying these fantasies to others, I'd be seriously concerned that they were on the limits of personality disorder.
Jackie, it appears, found it hard to believe it was a serious issue. Despite the school's insistence Daniel see a mental health specialist, she chose to keep a lid on the situation as best she could.
I don't think his father was aware that he had been having some counselling. It was something that his mum wanted him to keep to himself and to herself for his own confidence.
I don't actually believe that he was hearing voices. That's what I thought at the time. And I think Jackie thought the same. They all basically came up with the fact that, you know, having studied him and talked to him, that he was okay, there was nothing actually mentally wrong with him.
Jackie was relieved at the diagnosis, but what had Daniel actually been discussing in private with the specialist?
In the last session, apparently, when he came out of the session, she'd hugged him at the car as if to say, thank goodness that's over, we know you're all right, there's nothing to worry about now. But in that same session, unbeknown to Jackie, Daniel had said that she didn't treat him very well. I think it was a lot of it was sort of lies mixed up with sort of attention seeking.
Why had Daniel used his therapy sessions to vilify his mother? Did he genuinely believe this fantasy, or was there a darker plan brewing? Had he not been declared fit and well and had actually received some consistent therapy, might disaster have been averted? Or would he still have gone on to murder his mother? these voices he's claimed he heard in his head, I mean, they're so prescriptive. It does seem like they were taken straight out of one of these videos. It's nearly comedic. His tie is trying to strangle him. Was this a deliberate act, or did he really have voices in his head?
I don't think he really had voices in his head. He seized upon that one symptom of mental illness and used that and said, I'm hearing voices. You know, it's a stereotypical symptom of mental illness, isn't it? To evoke, sympathy in others.
This smacks to me as a, long journey to an alibi. I think it was really telling, and as one of the really graphic pictures of absolute manipulation by Daniel was when he told the school counsellor that was how awful his mother was, and she belittled him.
I think he'll be well aware of the fact that schools are obliged to look into it when children do something like this.
And then, the counsellor watches him walk out and give his mother, a fulsome hug, and you're thinking, well, those stories don't match up.
People like Daniel very much live in the present moment, and we often describe them as prisoners of the present. So they have difficulty reflecting on the past. They don't dwell on things. Because there's a real lack of conscience there, he's not going to get too hung up on the fact that somebody rumbled him at this point.
Now, being a prisoner of the present, in just the way you describe, well, there's another word for that, which is pointing towards a condition.
Here, I think we're looking at a case of psychopathic personality disorder. Personality disorders are not mental illnesses. People with personality disorders know the difference between right and wrong. They know, that it's not right to physically harm other people, but they choose to do so anyway.
What makes up a psychopath?
Well, there are various different traits and behaviours that we see in psychopaths, and this includes things like glibness, superficial charm, callousness, a lack of empathy, failure to take responsibility for own actions, those types of things. They are essentially all very self-centred behaviours.
Coming up, matricide carried out by a teen killer. It sends shockwaves across the community and across the country.
Daniel's barrister had asked him if he actually planned to kill his mother, and he replied, I didn't plan to kill her at that time.
At just 14, Daniel Bartlam is a troubled young man with feelings of rejection and low self-esteem after years of trying to process his parents' divorce. In his bedroom here, just behind me, he carefully scripts a violent drama based on his favourite soap opera, Coronation Street. In the story, Daniel casts himself as the lead and has his character fatally beat his mother to death and then successfully conceal the killing by dousing her body in petrol and setting it ablaze.
Daniel's barrister had asked him if he actually planned to kill his mother, and he replied, I didn't plan to kill her at that time. And I just remember being really shocked.
At 1 a.m. in the morning on Easter Monday, neighbours reported hearing a row between Daniel and his mother, apparently over where his new trainers were. The next thing they knew, flames had engulfed the top bedroom where Jackie slept, and fire engines were on the scene trying to put out the blaze.
I saw a story about a fire in Arnold, and I didn't think anything of it. I texted her sister, and I found out sort of basically that Jackie was missing. They'd found remains of a body in the fire, and she did. At that point, I didn't know what had happened or anything like that. All I knew was that a body had been found in the fire.
Daniel Bartlam had come out of the house alive with his dog and his brother, and he was the hero of that situation. And yeah, neighbours were concerned. They wondered what had been going on.
Daniel's story was that he found a hammer on the floor, and he threw the hammer at the supposed intruder, who then fled out of the window onto the flat roof and then down into the garden and away. And then obviously this intruder lit a fire before they ran.
Daniel made sure he'd saved his brother and dog, getting them out of danger, and then stood in front of the burning house. He appeared to want to be cast as the hero.
Unusually, Daniel was in crisp, clean clothes. The neighbour just remembered how unusual that was of him. Now, they're used to seeing him in perhaps, his tracksuit and bottoms from playing on his computer all day, and maybe his personal hygiene wasn't fantastic. The smoke pouring out the window, He's rescued his brother and the dog, and they've gone outside, and Daniel stood outside in clean clothes. And there was some suggestion that he'd actually gone back into the house and changed into fresh clothing and then gone outside. Doesn't really match the hero persona that he was trying to put across to people.
When police questioned him just hours after the crime, he stuck to his story. But it wasn't long before they too became suspicious and put the blame squarely on Daniel's shoulders. It was here in the Nottingham courts on the 2nd of April 2012, almost a year after his crime, where Daniel Bartlam was convicted of the murder of his mother. He was sentenced to a minimum of 16 years in jail.
I absolutely believe he did enjoy the trial, being the centre of attention. And again, the way he came across in the trial, the way he spoke to people, it just came across that way. That he was totally and utterly, thought that he hadn't done anything wrong.
Daniel showed surprising misplaced confidence when faced with the enormity of the murder trial. He tried to convince the court that he killed his mother in a fit of rage after a blazing row.
All through the evidence I gave, he stared straight at me. He sort of had a smirk more than a smile.
He was just a little boy in the dock, big thick set hair on his head, a baby face, looking completely out of his depth for the situation that he was in. And you wanted to believe that this little boy hadn't been responsible for such a terrible crime involving his own mother. And as time went on, when you saw him answering questions to the prosecution and the defence counsel, my opinion of him changed.
The thing that actually snookered him, and the police had found on some of his other computers, they'd been completely wiped. Some of the stories were written on the iMac, particularly the story about planning it and murdering his mum. That was found on the third backup on the computer.
He was convicted literally by his own hand, the words he'd penned as part of his murderous fantasy. He thought he was clever by deleting the file from his computer, but not clever enough. He was found guilty of premeditated murder. During cross-examination, he admitted to basically having killed her. He showed no remorse and also explained to the jury his obsession with, in his own words, how to get away with them violent crimes.
When he was found guilty, and he sort of crossed his neck as if to say, "You're next to me."
Without any hint of remorse or emotion, Daniel told in graphic detail the jury how he killed his mother with a claw hammer. This is the classic sign of a psychopath, but he was just 14 and came from a loving family. Where did he get his violent impulses from, and why did he act upon them?
When we look at children who kill their parents, they tend to fall into three categories. There's the severely abused child who hits back at the abusive parent, and that's not what we have here with Daniel Bartlam. There's the severely mentally ill child who's not in control of what they're doing, who doesn't know what they're doing is wrong, so they're not responsible for their behaviour. Well, that's not Daniel either, is it? Thirdly, we've got the dangerously antisocial child. This is somebody who very much knows the difference between right and wrong, but chooses to be violent and engage in these behaviours anyway. So here's somebody who's very cold, very calculating, who knows what they're doing.
So what makes a child killer?
If you look at the characteristics which are associated with things like psychopathy, so narcissism, shallow affect, so a real kind of shallowness of feeling. These are things that we see in a lot of teenagers, and it's completely normal teenage behaviour. So it's not surprising to me that a parent wouldn't join the dots up, especially a parent who wasn't aware of what that was. Because teenagers do behave in unpredictable ways. They do, quite mad things every now and then.
If somebody had identified Daniel as a psychopath or with that kind of mindset at an earlier age, is it possible to manage that?
In families where children are kind of neglected, they're abused, services pick up on that quite quickly, quite often, and will intervene. Children come onto the radar of the criminal justice system very, very soon. But because Daniel came from a nice background, he had a mum who cared about him, it meant that she kept him away from that for quite a long period of time.
I'm come back to the extraordinary irony that because Jackie was such a good mother, she camouflaged a lot of these traits, and therefore in many ways her own motherly love wrote her own death sentence, because if he'd been flagged earlier, somebody would have intervened and then he could have been managed and she would still be alive.
His behaviour has been on a trajectory for quite a considerable period of time, and it was to end in absolute tragedy.
At just 14 years of age, Daniel Bartlam committed a brutal and needless crime. The murder followed his script nearly word for word. With a 16-year sentence to serve, his storyline is now over. But the repercussions of his crime will be felt by his wider family and the community for decades to come.
There's an article in the Nottingham Post that we published, and in it his grandmother speaks about how she will never understand why Daniel murdered his mum. And she said, "I love Daniel, but I have to ask him the question, why? What's the answer, Dan? Just answer your nan and tell us why."
I still think about Daniel quite a lot. I don't worry about Daniel himself because you know what he's done, he's got coming to him. But I worry about if he got out, would he do it again? I think about what happened to his brother, because his brother's going to carry that for the rest of his life because obviously his brother witnessed it. And you know, his brother witnessing something like that at his age is horrific.
Thank you for watching. Murder UK is a website dedicated to giving the facts about murders and serial killers within the UK. Please consider subscribing and press that bell icon to be notified when we update new videos. Thank you.